The phone rang at 9:47 on a Tuesday night, and I almost let it go to voicemail. I did not recognize the number. Area code local, but not a contact. Not a name my phone would show me, just 10 digits glowing on the screen while I sat at my kitchen table with a mug of coffee gone cold beside my laptop. I answered because that is what I do. I answer things. I show up. I have spent 54 years being the man who answers the phone, who signs for the package, who reads the fine print nobody else wants to read. "Is this Daniel Cole?" the woman's voice asked. Steady, careful. The kind of careful that comes from someone who has rehearsed a sentence in the mirror more than once. "Speaking," I said. "My name is Elaine Bell," she said. "I think you need to sit down." I was already sitting down. I told her that, and there was a pause on the other end. A breath drawn in slow, like she was gathering the last of her courage before she stepped off a ledge she'd been standing on for weeks. "My husband's name is Marcus Bell," she said. "I believe he has been having an affair with your wife. I believe they have been taking money out of your joint account together. And I have proof. All of it. Bank transfers, texts, hotel receipts. I have been documenting this for 2 months, Mr. Cole, and I am done protecting him." The mug slipped in my hand. Coffee, cold and bitter, splashed across a stack of unopened mail I hadn't gotten to yet, across a flyer for Vanessa's 50th birthday party at the Ridgemont Club, the one I'd been asked to pay a $4,000 deposit for just 11 days earlier. "I'm sorry," I said, "because that is the kind of man I am. The kind who apologizes reflexively, even when the wound is being opened in his own chest." "Who did you say you were?" "Elaine Bell," she repeated, patient now, the way you repeat something to a man who has just been told a piece of bad news too large for his mind to hold all at once. "I'm going to send you an email tonight. It will have everything in it. I need you to look at it before you talk to her, before you say a word to your wife. Can you promise me that?" I did not answer right away. I looked across the kitchen at the calendar on the wall, at Vanessa's handwriting circling the date of her birthday party in red ink, 3 weeks out, and at the small magnetic frame beside it holding a photo of our daughter Maddie at her high school graduation. Sun in her eyes, my arm around her shoulders. I looked at the space on the counter where Vanessa's purse usually sat when she was home, and it was not there. Because she had told me 2 hours earlier that she was meeting a client about a home staging job in the city and would be late. "I promise," I said. Elaine Bell exhaled like she had been holding that breath for 2 years. "Check your email," she said. "And Mr. Cole, I am so sorry to be the one telling you this. I know exactly what this feels like. I have known for a long time." The line went dead. I sat there in my kitchen with cold coffee soaking into a flyer that promised an evening of champagne and string quartets. And I opened my email, and I began to read the first document Elaine Bell had sent me. A bank statement from an account I did not recognize, showing a transfer of $11,000 from our joint checking account dated 6 weeks earlier. My hands did not shake. That surprised me later when I thought back on it. My hands were steady as stone. It was my chest that was shaking. Some deep structural thing giving way floor by floor. And I remember thinking with a strange, cold clarity that would carry me through everything that came after, that I had absolutely no idea in that moment just how much my wife had already taken from me. I want to tell you how we got there, because it did not start with a phone call from a stranger. It started, as these things always do, with small things I noticed and did not say out loud. Things I told myself were nothing. My name is Daniel Cole. I am 54 years old. For 22 years, I worked as an operations manager for Halloran Freight, a regional trucking company out of Ohio. The kind of job that does not make headlines but keeps a family fed and a mortgage paid. Back when we still had a mortgage. I grew up in a small brick house on English Street that my father built onto twice with his own hands. And when he died 8 years ago, he left that house to me, paid off in full, not a dollar owed on it. I never told many people that. Vanessa's family certainly never thought much of it. To them, it was a starter home in a neighborhood that hadn't started anything in 30 years. I married Vanessa when I was 30. She was beautiful in the specific, sharpened way that some women are beautiful. The kind of beauty that makes a room reorganize itself around her without her having to ask. She came from money that had thinned out by the time it reached her. Old family money, mostly gone to lawyers and bad investments 2 generations back. But the manners had survived, even after the money hadn't, and Vanessa wore those manners like armor. She could walk into the Ridgemont Club and make you believe she owned the deed to the golf course. I loved her. I want to be honest about that, because a story like mine is easy to tell as though the love was never real, as though I saw it coming from the beginning and simply waited around like a fool. That is not true. I loved Vanessa Whitfield Cole for 24 years. I loved the way she laughed, with her whole head thrown back at things that were only a little bit funny. I loved that she remembered everyone's name at a party after being introduced once. I loved that she made our daughter's birthday cakes from scratch every single year until Maddie left for college. 3-tiered, ridiculous, glorious cakes that took her all day and that she never once complained about making. But somewhere in the last several years, something in Vanessa began to change. Or maybe something in Vanessa that had always been there simply stopped hiding. It started, if I am honest, around the time her sister Denise divorced her second husband and came out the other side of it with a house in a gated community and a leased Mercedes and a new circle of women who lunched at places where the salads cost $22. Vanessa began comparing, quietly at first, a comment here about how the Hendersons redid their kitchen, a comment there about how it must be nice to not worry about money the way we did. We were not poor. I want to be clear about that. We had a good life. The house was paid for. I had a steady pension coming and a 401k I had been feeding faithfully since I was 26 years old, because my father taught me that money is not about what you spend, it is about what you keep. And I kept things. I kept receipts, I kept spreadsheets, every Sunday night for as long as I can remember. After Vanessa had gone up to bed, I sat at that same kitchen table and reconciled our accounts, checked every transaction against every statement, made sure the numbers matched what I expected them to match. It was not an obsession. It was a discipline. The same discipline my father used checking the tension on a bandsaw blade before every cut. You check the thing that matters. You check it every time. That is how you keep from losing a finger, or a house, or, in my case, apparently, a marriage. About 2.5 years before that phone call from Elaine Bell, I started noticing discrepancies in our joint account that I could not explain. Nothing dramatic. $200 here for a consultation, $300 there for something labeled only with a merchant code I didn't recognize. When I asked Vanessa about it, gently, the way you ask a question you don't want to turn into a fight, she waved it off. Client gifts, staging supplies. The cost of doing business in her little home staging venture, which had never, in 6 years, turned a real profit, though I had never said that out loud either. Something in me, some old animal part that had watched my own father get quietly cleaned out by a business partner once when I was a teenager, told me to be careful. So I did something I never told Vanessa about. I opened a second account, a private one, under a trust I set up using my mother's maiden name, Whitmore. The Whitmore Family Trust. I moved the bulk of my retirement rollover into it, along with money from an inheritance my father had left specifically to me, not to us. An inheritance Vanessa knew existed but had never asked to see the details of, because in 24 years of marriage, financial specifics were the one subject Vanessa Cole had never once shown any real interest in. I did not do this because I suspected an affair. I want to be honest about that too, because this is not a story about a genius man who saw it all coming. I did it because I suspected carelessness. I thought, at worst, Vanessa was spending more than she should on her business, or on herself, and that I needed to protect what my father had built and what I had built on top of it, for Maddie's sake if nothing else. I told myself it was prudent. I told myself every man who grew up watching his own father lose things learns to build a second door out of every room he stands in. I had no idea, sitting at that kitchen table 2.5 years ago, quietly moving money into an account with my mother's name on it, that I was building the very thing that would one day save my life. Maddie was the center of everything for me during those years. Our daughter, 20 years old when this all began to surface, a sophomore studying environmental engineering at State, on partial scholarship, working a part-time job at a campus coffee shop to cover the rest. She had my father's stubbornness and Vanessa's laugh, and she was, without question, the best thing either of us had ever made. She called me every Sunday afternoon, without fail, just to talk, not because she needed anything, but because that was who she was. She used to say, "Dad, you're the most boring, interesting person I know." And I never understood exactly what she meant by that until later, when boring turned out to be the very thing that saved us both. Vanessa had a habit in those last 2 years of calling me things when she thought I wasn't really listening, or maybe when she wanted me to hear and pretend I hadn't. "You're like furniture, Daniel," she said once at a dinner party at Denise's house, laughing lightly to the other women at the table while I stood by the drink cart refilling glasses. "Sturdy, reliable. You just sort of sit there." Everyone laughed. I laughed too, because that is what you do. You laugh along with the joke that has your own name carved into the punchline, and you tell yourself it does not cost you anything to laugh. It cost me plenty. I just did not know how to price it yet. Marcus Bell entered our lives, as far as I can reconstruct it now, about 8 months before that phone call. Vanessa met him, she said, through a networking event for small business owners downtown. A self-styled wealth strategist who ran something called Bell Meridian Capital out of a rented office suite on the 9th floor of a building that also housed 2 law firms and a dental practice. He had the kind of tan that comes from a bed, not the sun, and a watch he made sure you noticed without ever mentioning it. Vanessa started talking about him at dinner. "Marcus says this. Marcus thinks that. Marcus has this incredible strategy for diversifying into private equity that could triple our nest egg in 5 years if we just had the capital to get in early." I should have known then. I want to be honest with you, the way I have tried to be honest through all of this, because there is no dignity in pretending I was some flawless observer who caught every signal and only failed to act. I noticed. I noticed the new perfume. I noticed the phone that started staying face down on the counter, the phone that used to sit face up without a second thought. I noticed the late nights with clients that never used to happen more than once a month and started happening twice a week. I noticed, and I told myself the same thing men have told themselves since the beginning of time. I told myself I was imagining it. I told myself 24 years of marriage had earned us the benefit of the doubt. I told myself Vanessa loved me, in her way, even if her way had grown quieter over the years. Even if the woman who used to fall asleep with her hand on my chest now fell asleep facing the wall. That was the marriage I was standing inside of on the night Elaine Bell called me. That was the man who sat at his kitchen table with cold coffee soaking into a party flyer, opening an email from a stranger, learning that his wife had taken $63,500 out of their joint account over the course of 4 months, and handed nearly all of it to a man who was, according to the woman married to him, not a wealth strategist at all, but something else entirely. I did not sleep that night. I sat at that table until 4 in the morning, going through every document Elaine Bell had sent, and by the time the sun came up over English Street, I understood 2 things with absolute clarity. The first was that my marriage, as I had understood it for 24 years, was already over, whether I said the words out loud or not. The second was that I was not going to let anyone see me break. Not yet. Not until I understood exactly what I was dealing with. I made a pot of coffee I would not drink, and I began, very quietly, to build a folder. The folder started as a plain manila one, the kind you buy in a box of 100 at the office supply store. And over the coming weeks, it would grow into something else entirely. Something with tabs and dates and a spreadsheet I built by hand. But that first morning, it started with 3 printed pages from Elaine Bell's email and a single word written on the tab in my own steady handwriting. Household. I wrote that word deliberately. If Vanessa ever found it sitting on my desk, I wanted it to look exactly as boring as everything else about me was supposed to look. Elaine's email that night had been careful, methodical, almost clinical in a way I would come to understand as the weeks went on. Because Elaine Bell was not a woman acting on impulse. She was a woman who had spent 2 years learning her husband's patterns the hard way. The way you learn the layout of a house by walking into the same table in the dark too many times. She had attached 6 bank statements from 3 different accounts, one of them a joint account she shared with Marcus, showing deposits that matched, almost to the day, withdrawals from what I now knew was our joint checking account at First Heritage Bank. $11,000 in April, described in Vanessa's transfer memo only as investment consult. $9,000 in May. $14,500 in June. Right around the time Vanessa told me our home equity line needed adjusting because of market volatility, a phrase I now understood she had likely lifted directly from Marcus Bell's mouth. Another 11 in July. The rest bled out in smaller amounts, 500 here, 800 there, dinners and hotel stays that Elaine had cross-referenced with credit card statements Marcus didn't know she still had access to. A joint card from early in their marriage that he had simply forgotten to cancel. $63,500. That was the number Elaine's spreadsheet landed on, and when I checked it against our own joint account the next morning, quietly, from my phone in the parking lot of Halloran Freight before my shift started, the number matched almost exactly. Vanessa had drained the account down to $1,800. $1,800 in an account that 8 months earlier had held nearly $70,000. Money we had been saving for a kitchen renovation, for Maddie's junior year abroad program, for the kind of ordinary future 2 people build when they still believe they are building it together. I sat in that parking lot with my hands gripping the steering wheel so hard my knuckles went white, and I did not honk the horn or scream or put my fist through the windshield. I sat very still, the way my father used to sit still when a piece of machinery broke down on him. Not because he wasn't furious, but because he had learned a long time ago that fury spent on noise is fury wasted, and fury saved is fury that can actually be aimed at something. I went inside and worked my shift. 8 hours. I signed off on 3 delivery manifests, resolved a scheduling conflict between 2 drivers, and ate a sandwich alone in my truck at lunch because I could not sit across from anyone and pretend my life had not just come apart at the seams. Nobody at Halloran Freight noticed a thing. That was, I would learn, going to become one of my great advantages in the months ahead. I have spent my whole life being the man nobody notices too closely. It turns out that is not a weakness. It is camouflage. That evening, Vanessa came home at 7:15, smelling faintly of a perfume that was not the one I had bought her for Christmas, carrying a garment bag from a boutique downtown. "You would not believe the day I had," she said, kissing the air near my cheek the way she had started doing over the last year, a habit I had noticed and not named. "A client wanted the whole staging redone 2 days before the open house. I am exhausted." "Sounds like it," I said, and I meant it to sound normal, and apparently it did, because she did not so much as glance at me twice before disappearing upstairs to change. I sat at the table where I had cried, alone, at 4 that morning, and I watched her walk up our staircase in a dress I did not recognize, and I understood, with a coldness that surprised even me, that I was now living 2 separate lives inside the same house. There was the Daniel Cole that Vanessa saw, steady, reliable, furniture. And there was the Daniel Cole sitting at the table, who now knew exactly what she had done, exactly how much she had taken, and exactly who she had given it to. I decided that first week that I would not confront her yet. Not out of cowardice. I want to be very clear about that, because I know how this can sound. A man staying silent while his wife carries on an affair under his roof? But I had learned something from 22 years managing logistics for a trucking company. Something my father had taught me even before that. You do not confront a problem before you understand its full shape. You do not fix a broken axle by yelling at the truck. You get underneath it. You look. You take your time, even when every part of you wants to move fast. Because the men who move fast are the men who miss the crack that was already spreading before they ever picked up the wrench. So I watched, and I planned, and most importantly, I called Frank Ostrander. Frank and I had gone to high school together, back when English Street still had kids playing stickball in it after dinner. And while I had gone into logistics, Frank had gone to law school on a scholarship and built a small but sharp family law practice 2 towns over. We had stayed close in the loose way old friends do. A beer every few months, a phone call on birthdays. I called him on a Thursday night from my truck in the Halloran parking lot, engine running for the heat, and I told him everything. Frank was quiet for a long moment after I finished. "Dan," he finally said, "how long have you known?" 6 days, I said, "and you haven't said anything to her." "No." "Good," he said, and something in the way he said it, flat and certain, settled something in my chest that had been shaking since Elaine Bell's phone call. "Listen to me very carefully. In this state, what she did, taking marital funds and giving them to someone outside the marriage, that's called dissipation of assets. It matters, Dan. It matters a lot in a divorce, in how a judge looks at the division of what's left. But it only matters if you can prove it, and you can only prove it if she doesn't have time to cover her tracks first. So whatever you do not tip her off. Not yet." "I have documents," I said, "from his wife." There was a pause on the line. "His wife called you?" She emailed me statements, bank records. She says she's been building a case against him for 2 years. Frank exhaled slowly, and I could picture him leaning back in whatever chair he was sitting in, the way he used to lean back at his desk during exam week back in school, thinking 3 moves ahead of everyone else in the room. "Dan," he said, "that woman just handed you the best gift anyone could hope for in a situation like this. Do not waste it. I want you to come into my office Monday morning. Bring everything. Do not tell Vanessa. Do not tell anyone, not even Maddie, not yet. The fewer people who know, the more time we have to move." "Move?" I repeated. "Move where, Frank? I don't even know what I'm doing yet." "You're protecting what's left," he said. "And then you're going to decide whether you want to fight quiet or fight loud. Either way, Dan, you're going to need to be the calmest person in every single room you walk into for the next few months. Can you do that?" I thought about my father, standing over a broken bandsaw with his jaw set and his hands perfectly still, working the problem instead of the panic. "Yeah," I said, "I can do that." "There's something else," Frank said, and I could hear papers shifting on the other end of the line, the particular rustle of a man reaching for a legal pad even at 9 o'clock at night. Because Frank Ostrander had never once in 30 years stopped being the kind of lawyer who took notes on everything, even a phone call from an old friend from English Street. "I want you to start a log. Not just the bank statements, Dan. A written log. Dates, times, what you saw, what she said, what you didn't say back. Judges like documents, but they love documents that show a pattern building in real time, not something assembled after the fact to make a case look better than it was. Can you do that?" "I can do that," I said again. And I meant it in the exhausted, determined way a man means a promise he has just realized is going to cost him something every single day for months. "One more thing," Frank said. His voice dropping into the register he used, I remembered from watching him once in a courtroom years earlier, when a mutual friend's custody case had gone sideways. The register he reserved for the parts of the conversation that mattered most. "Don't let this turn you into someone you're not. I've seen men do this before, Dan. They find out what's been done to them, and something breaks loose in them. Some old anger they didn't know they were carrying, and they start making mistakes. They confront too early. They say something cruel they can't take back. They let the hurt drive instead of the head. You are the calmest, most careful man I have ever known. That is your advantage in this. Don't trade it away because you're angry, even when you have every right to be." I sat with that for a long moment, watching my breath fog faintly against the truck's cold windshield, the loading dock lights humming orange across the empty lot. "I'm not angry," I said, and even as I said it, I understood it was not quite true. "I don't know what I am yet." "That's honest," Frank said. "That's good. Give it time to sort itself out. You don't have to know exactly what you feel to know exactly what you're going to do. Those are 2 different jobs, and you only need to do one of them right now." I thought, sitting there, about the first time I had ever seen Vanessa, 26 years earlier, at a wedding for a mutual friend from college. The way she had stood near the punch table in a pale yellow dress, laughing at something one of the bridesmaids said, her whole head thrown back the way it always did, and how I had walked over without any plan at all, without any of the careful preparation I brought to everything else in my life, and asked her to dance simply because I could not imagine standing in that room and not knowing her name. I had been, in that moment, Exactly the kind of man Frank was warning me not to lose. Impulsive, once, a long time ago, before 22 years of logistics and spreadsheets and Sunday night reconciliations had worn the impulsiveness down into something steadier, more careful, more prepared to check every bolt before trusting the machine to hold weight. I wondered, not for the first time and certainly not for the last, when exactly that young man dancing near a punch table had disappeared, and whether Vanessa had noticed him leaving before I had. "Dan," Frank said gently, after a silence had stretched long enough that he must have sensed where my mind had wandered. "You still there?" "I'm here," I said. "I was just thinking about how we met." "That's allowed," Frank said. "Grieving what you thought you had is not the same as being weak, Dan. You're allowed to miss the marriage you believed you were in, even while you're building the case against the one you were actually in. Both things can be true at the same time. I've watched a lot of people go through this. The ones who do it well are the ones who let themselves feel it without letting it steer the wheel." I nodded, alone in my truck, as though he could see me, and something in his patience reminded me, briefly and sharply, of my father, standing over a stalled engine with a rag in his back pocket. Never in a hurry, never raising his voice at a machine that could not hear him anyway, just working the problem steadily until it gave up its secret. "What about Maddie?" I asked, because it was the question that had been sitting underneath every other question since the moment Elaine Bell's voice had come through my phone. I hate keeping this from her. Frank was quiet for a moment. "How old is she now? 20? 20, sophomore. She's 3 hours away at state." "Then you have some room," Frank said. "Not forever, but some. She's not in the house day to day, watching this unfold in front of her the way she would be if she still lived at home. That buys you time to build something solid before you have to hand her a piece of news that's going to change how she sees both of her parents, permanently, for the rest of her life. When you do tell her, and you will, Dan, you want to be able to tell her the whole thing, cleanly, with a plan already in place, not a half-finished mess you're still scrambling to understand yourself. Kids, even grown kids, even kids in college, they can smell an unfinished crisis a mile away. It scares them more than the truth does. Give her the truth once it's whole. I thought about Maddie's voice on the phone every Sunday, steady and warm, asking about my week, about the Sunday roast I still tried to make, even with the house half empty most nights now, about whether the Cardinals had any shot this season, the easy, unburdened rhythm of a daughter who trusted, without having to think about it, that her parents' marriage was simply one of the fixed points in her world. Boring, maybe, the way she used to tease me, but solid. I did not want to be the one who took that fixed point away from her before I understood exactly how to hand her something steadier to stand on in its place. "Okay," I said. "I'll wait. But not forever." "Not forever," Frank agreed. "Just long enough to do this right." We talked another 20 minutes after that, Frank walking me through the mechanics of what he called the discovery phase, though we both understood he meant something broader than the legal term, something closer to an excavation of an entire life I had thought I already fully understood. He told me to request full statements going back further than I had originally planned, not just 8 months, but 2 full years, so we could see whether the pattern of missing money predated Marcus Bell entirely, whether it had started, as these things sometimes do, as something smaller and more forgivable, that had simply been allowed to grow in the dark because nobody had ever turned the light on it. He told me to keep my own new account entirely separate, never to transfer between the two in a way that would look, on paper, like an attempt to hide funds, rather than an attempt to protect what remained. He told me, more than once, in different words each time, that patience was not going to feel like strength while I was living inside it, that it was going to feel, most days, like cowardice, like a slow and humiliating failure to simply stand up and say the truth out loud. But that patience, done right, was the only thing standing between the man I was that night in the parking lot and the man Vanessa's family had always assumed I was. A man too small and too passive to ever notice what was being taken from him. I don't want to be either version, I told Frank, somewhere near the end of the call, the heater in my truck finally cutting through the cold that had settled into my bones sometime during the last 20 minutes. The angry one or the small one? Then don't be, Frank said simply. Be the one who builds something. That's who you've always been, Dan. Even if nobody in that family ever bothered to notice. You built a career nobody respected into a life that's kept a roof over your daughter's head and a house paid off free and clear. You built a marriage you believed in for 24 years, even if it turned out to be standing on ground you didn't fully understand. Building is what you do. So build this. Build the case. Build the plan. And when it's finished, when it's solid enough to hold the weight of everything that's about to come down on top of it, you won't have to decide whether to be angry or small. You'll already know exactly who you are. I sat with that for a long moment, the truck's heater humming, the loading dock lights glowing steady orange through the windshield. And something in my chest, some knot that had been pulled tight since Elaine Bell's first phone call, loosened, just slightly. Just enough to breathe around. I'll have the 2 years of statements requested by Monday, I said. And I'll start the log tonight, before I forget half of what's happened this week already. Good, Frank said. Then let's go to work. Good, Frank said. Then let's go to work. I hung up the phone and sat in my truck a long while, watching the lights of the loading dock flicker on in the dark. And something in me that had been a frightened, wounded man for 6 straight days quietly stood back up. Not healed, not even close, but standing. I want to tell you about the second phone call from Elaine Bell, because it happened 10 days after the first. And it changed the shape of everything I thought I understood about what was happening to my family. She called on a Sunday evening while Vanessa was out at what she called a girls' night with Denise, though I would later learn Denise had not seen her sister in almost 3 weeks and had no idea what Vanessa was actually doing on those nights. I took the call sitting on the back porch, the same porch my father had built the summer before he died. And Elaine's voice this time was different, less careful, more tired, in the specific way of someone who has been carrying something heavy for a very long time and has finally set part of it down. I need to tell you something else, she said. Something I should have told you the first time we spoke. Okay, I said. Vanessa is not the first, Elaine said. She's not even the second. Marcus has done this before, twice that I know of, going back 6 years. There was a woman in Cincinnati, a widow, who gave him almost $40,000 for what he called a private equity fund. There was a woman here in town, 2 years ago, before Vanessa, who I believe gave him closer to 20. He never marries them, Mr. Cole. He never even really leaves me, not for good. He just circles back. He finds women who are lonely, or bored, or angry at their husbands, women who want someone to make them feel important again, and he takes what he can before they figure it out, or he gets bored and moves to the next one. I sat with the phone pressed to my ear, looking out at the yard where Maddie used to run through the sprinkler as a little girl, and I felt something shift inside me that was almost, strangely, a kind of relief. Because as much as it should have made things worse, learning that my wife's affair was not even original, not even special, that she was one entry in a pattern a con man had perfected on other lonely, wounded women, long before he ever met her, something about that fact took a little of the personal sting out of it. It was not that Vanessa had found something in Marcus Bell that she could not find in me. It was that Marcus Bell had found something in Vanessa that he could find in almost any woman willing to believe him. "Why are you telling me this?" I asked. "Why now? Why me?" Elaine was quiet for a moment. "Because I filed for divorce 3 weeks ago," she said, quietly. "My attorney has been building a case for over a year, and I have decided that I am done letting him hide behind other men's marriages while he destroys them. I have decided that the kindest thing I can do, for you and for every woman who comes after you, is to make sure this time someone sees it coming before it's too late to stop it." "What do you need from me?" I asked, because some instinct told me this conversation was not one-sided, that Elaine Bell had not simply called out of pure kindness, but was also, in her own quiet and controlled way, building something of her own. "I need you to be willing to testify, eventually, if it comes to that," she said, "about the money, about what you find when you look closer. My attorney believes there may be a pattern here that crosses into fraud. Not just an affair, Mr. Cole. Real fraud. If 2 or 3 of us come forward together, this stops being a messy divorce story and starts being something a district attorney has to look at." I looked down at the folder sitting on the porch table beside me, the one still labeled simply household, and I thought about my father and the business partner who had cleaned him out decades earlier and walked away clean because nobody had ever built a case strong enough to stop him. I thought about Maddie, 20 years old, still believing her parents' marriage was a steady, if occasionally boring, thing. I thought about the $63,500 sitting in some account that was not mine anymore, and about the Whitmore Trust sitting quietly in my name, untouched, my mother's maiden name doing exactly what I had built it to do 2.5 years earlier, without ever knowing why. "I'll help you," I said. "Whatever you need." "Thank you," Elaine said, and for the first time in either conversation, her voice cracked, just slightly, at the edges. "I know how strange this must feel, building something with a stranger over the wreckage your own husband and my own wife left behind." "It's not strange," I said, and I meant it. "It's the first thing that's made sense to me in 2 weeks." We hung up, and I sat on that porch until the porch light drew moths against the screen, and the temperature dropped enough that I could see my breath. And I thought about the shape of the thing I was now building. Not revenge, exactly, not yet. Something closer to architecture. A foundation, poured quiet and slow that no one standing above it would ever see until the day it held the whole weight of what came crashing down. I did not know, sitting there that night, just how much weight that foundation was going to have to hold, or how many more months I would have to sit across a dinner table from a woman I had loved for 24 years, pretending I did not already know the exact dollar amount of every lie she had told me. But I knew one thing with absolute certainty, the same certainty my father had when he looked at a broken machine and understood, before he ever picked up a tool, exactly how he was going to fix it. I sat with that certainty a long while, letting the cold seep into my jacket, watching my breath rise and disappear against the dark yard where Maddie used to run barefoot through summer grass. And I found myself thinking, unexpectedly, of a specific afternoon from my childhood, one I had not remembered in years. I was maybe 11 years old, standing in the garage on English Street, watching my father wrestle with a lawn tractor engine that had seized up on him 3 summers running. A neighbor, Mr. Halverson, had stopped by that day to offer his opinion, the way men used to do over a fence line before anyone thought twice about it. And he had told my father, plainly, that the engine was junk, that he was wasting his Saturday, that some things were simply not worth saving. My father had not argued. He had simply nodded, thanked Mr. Halverson for his opinion, and gone back to work the moment the man walked away, patient as stone, taking the whole engine apart piece by piece across a drop cloth on the garage floor, cleaning each part by hand, checking it against a manual he kept in a drawer full of manuals nobody else in the neighborhood still owned. It took him 6 weekends. 6 weekends of a man everyone assumed was wasting his time, working quietly in a garage nobody else believed was worth the effort. And on the 7th weekend, that engine turned over on the first try, and ran clean for 11 more years after that. Long after Mr. Halverson's own riding mower, purchased new that same summer, had already broken down twice and gone to the scrapyard. I had asked my father once, years later, how he had known the engine was worth saving when everyone around him had already written it off. He had wiped his hands on a rag, the way he always did before answering a real question, and said, "I didn't know, Danny. I just wasn't willing to let somebody else's opinion decide what I hadn't finished checking for myself." I had been maybe 14 when he said that to me, too young to understand it as anything more than a comment about a lawn tractor. Sitting on that porch, 40 years later, with a folder full of my own wife's betrayal resting on the table beside me, I finally understood exactly what he had meant. Everyone in Vanessa's family, everyone at that country club, every person who had ever offered me a thin, polite nod across 24 years of dinner parties had already decided, long ago, what kind of man I was. Steady, reliable, unremarkable. Furniture. They had made that judgment the way Mr. Halverson had judged that engine, from the outside, without ever once bothering to take anything apart and look closely at what was actually inside. And I understood, sitting there in the cold, that the entire architecture I had spent the last 2 months quietly building, the trust, the folder, the alliance with Elaine, the careful, patient documentation of every dollar Vanessa had taken, was really just me doing the only thing my father had ever taught me how to do with real conviction. Refusing to let someone else's lazy opinion decide what I had not yet finished checking for myself. I went inside a little after 11, the porch light still burning behind me, and I stood for a moment in the dark kitchen, listening to the particular silence of a house where one person is asleep upstairs and another is standing very still at the bottom of the stairs, holding a folder heavy enough to end a marriage. I did not go up right away. I walked instead to the small hallway closet by the front door, where we kept old photo albums Vanessa had never gotten around to digitizing, and I pulled one out almost without deciding to, an instinct more than a plan. The same kind of instinct that had made me open the Whitmore account 2.5 years earlier without fully understanding why. I sat on the bottom stair and opened the album under the dim glow of the hallway light. And there we were, Vanessa and I, 28 years old, standing in front of this very house the week we closed on it, my father's arm slung proudly around both our shoulders. 3 months before he would first start complaining about a cough that turned out to be something far worse than any of us wanted to believe. Vanessa was laughing in that photograph, her whole head thrown back, exactly the way she still laughed now. And I remembered, looking at it, that she had cried real tears that day, standing on the porch steps, telling my father this was the first time in her whole life she had ever felt like a place actually belonged to her instead of the other way around. I did not know, sitting there at nearly midnight with that album open across my knees, whether the woman in that photograph and the woman upstairs pretending to be asleep were still, in any meaningful sense, the same person. I suspected, the way you suspect a fracture in a wall long before you actually see the crack reach the surface, that something in Vanessa had been slowly separating from that porch step version of herself for years, long before Marcus Bell ever existed, and that a man named Marcus Bell had simply been the first person patient enough, or predatory enough, to notice the separation and walk directly into the space it left behind. I closed the album gently and set it back on its shelf, and I climbed the stairs slowly, the way I always did, careful not to wake anyone, even though there was, technically, no one left in that house who did not already know exactly how careful and quiet I could be. I lay down beside Vanessa in the dark, close enough to hear her breathing, far enough that no part of us touched. And I stared at the ceiling for a long time, running the numbers in my head one more time, the way another man might count sheep. $63,500. 11 separate withdrawals. 2.5 years of careful, quiet building on my end, running silently underneath a marriage that had been, for reasons I was only beginning to fully understand, quietly ending on hers. I thought about Frank's voice on the phone, calm and certain. I thought about Elaine Bell's voice, cracking just slightly at the edges of a stranger's kindness. I thought about my father's rag-wiped hands and his patient, unhurried certainty in a garage nobody else believed was worth the effort. And somewhere in the space between all of those voices, lying awake beside a woman I no longer fully recognized, I felt the last soft edge of the man I had been for 24 years finally, quietly, settle into something harder and more certain underneath it. I was not furniture. Not anymore. I was not furniture. Not anymore. I had just forgotten, for a while, what I was actually made of. The next morning, Vanessa asked me, almost as an afterthought while pouring her coffee, whether I had thought any more about the birthday party budget. I was thinking maybe we push it to $5,000, she said, not quite looking at me. Denise thinks the club's champagne package is worth it for the 50th. It's a milestone, Daniel. It certainly is, I said, and I smiled, and I meant every layer of what I said, and she had absolutely no idea. I want to slow down here, because the next stretch of my life, the weeks that followed those 2 calls from Elaine Bell, are the part of this story where I learned things about my own marriage that I still, all these months later, find difficult to say out loud in a straight line. This was the season where the wound stopped being a mystery and started becoming a map, and every new detail I uncovered was another line drawn on a territory I had thought, for over 2 decades, that I already fully understood. Monday morning, I drove to Frank Ostrander's office before my shift, the folder now labeled Household sitting on the passenger seat like a passenger of its own. Frank's office was small, 2 rooms above a dry cleaner, but it had always struck me as exactly the kind of place a man went to get serious, unglamorous work done. No marble floors, no skyline views, just a desk, 2 chairs, and a wall of case files that told you Frank Ostrander had spent 30 years watching marriages come apart and had learned, better than almost anyone I knew, exactly where the seams tended to give. He read through everything I had. The bank statements Elaine had sent, my own printouts from our joint account going back 8 months, every withdrawal circled in red pen the way I used to circle discrepancies on delivery manifests. He read slowly, methodically, occasionally making a small sound in his throat that I had learned in high school meant he had found something worth remembering. I watched him work the way I used to watch my father work on an engine, unhurried, methodical, turning a page and setting it face down on a growing stack, occasionally sliding 2 documents side by side and studying them together before moving on. Frank had always had that quality, even back in high school, when the rest of us were skimming through a chemistry lab just to get to lunch, and Frank was the only one still checking his math twice. It used to annoy some people. I had always found it reassuring, the particular comfort of watching a careful man do a careful job with something that mattered. "Tell me about the trust again," he said without looking up, flipping to the page where I had printed the Whitmore account summary. "Walk me through exactly how you set it up. I want the whole thing, Dan, not the short version." So I told him. I told him about the Tuesday afternoon, 2.5 years earlier, when I had sat in my truck in the parking lot of a different bank altogether, First Merchant, 2 towns over from First Heritage, because some instinct I could not fully name at the time had told me not to open anything new in a branch where Vanessa was a familiar face to the tellers. I told him about walking in with my father's death certificate, the inheritance paperwork from the estate attorney who had handled things when he passed, and a single sheet listing my mother's full maiden name, Eleanor Whitmore, dead 11 years by then, gone quietly in her sleep the winter after my father's diagnosis, as though she had simply decided she could not watch what was coming and had gone ahead of him instead. "I used her name because it felt right," I told Frank, "not because I was trying to hide anything from anyone in particular. I told myself at the time that it was a tribute, a way of keeping something of hers alive in the family, since we never used her name for much of anything else. Looking back now, I think some part of me already understood I was building a door only I would know how to open." Frank nodded slowly, still writing. "Your instincts were better than you gave yourself credit for," he said. "Most people don't listen to that quiet voice until it's too late to matter. You listened 2.5 years early. That is rare, Dan. That is rarer than you know." I thought, sitting in that small office above the dry cleaner, about the specific afternoon that had actually triggered the decision, because Frank was right to press for the whole story, not the short version, and the whole story mattered more than I had let myself admit even to him at first. It had been a Sunday in early spring, the kind of gray, damp Ohio Sunday that makes everything smell like wet concrete, and I had been doing my usual reconciliation at the kitchen table while Vanessa was upstairs getting ready for a staging consultation that was, I now understood with the clarity of hindsight, very likely the first or second time she had ever met Marcus Bell, though I would not learn that timeline for certain until months later. I had found a withdrawal that day, $420, cash, taken directly from an ATM instead of run through a card the way Vanessa did almost everything else. It was such a small amount in isolation. It should not have mattered. But something about the specific mechanism, cash pulled deliberately from a machine rather than logged through a card statement the way she normally shopped, had struck me as strange in a way I could not name at the time. The way a single loose board in an otherwise solid floor can make a whole house feel less trustworthy, even before you understand exactly which board it was. I had not confronted her about it. I had simply, quietly, the following Tuesday, opened the Whitmore account and begun moving small amounts of my own money into it. A little at first, cautious, testing the water the way you test a plank before putting your full weight on it. Over the following months, as the discrepancies grew larger and stranger, so did my transfers into that account, until, by the time Elaine Bell's phone call came, the Whitmore Trust held nearly all of my retirement rollover, the full remainder of my father's inheritance, and a savings cushion I had quietly built out of overtime pay Vanessa never asked me to account for, because she had, I now understood, stopped paying close attention to my finances at almost exactly the same moment she stopped paying close attention to me. "You built that instinctively," Frank said when I finished, "before you had proof of anything. That matters in ways I don't think you fully appreciate yet, Dan. A lot of men in your position panic after the fact and start moving money defensively, and courts see straight through that because the timing gives it away. You didn't do that. You built this slowly, over years, for reasons that had nothing to do with hiding anything from a court and everything to do with basic prudence. That is the difference between a man protecting his family and a man trying to cheat one. You are the former. Never let anyone, including yourself, tell you otherwise." I sat with that for a moment, looking around Frank's office at the case files stacked along the far wall, dozens of them, each one representing some other family's version of the exact unraveling I was living through. And I thought about how strange it was that a room this small and this unremarkable had become, in the span of a single meeting, the most important room in my life. Not the ballroom Vanessa was already planning at the Ridgemont Club, not even my own kitchen, where 24 years of marriage had been eaten and argued and laughed through. This room, with its water-stained ceiling tile and its ancient window unit rattling in the corner, was where the actual architecture of my future was being drawn, line by careful line. Frank kept reading, cross-referencing dates against the calendar app on his phone, occasionally asking me a clarifying question about a specific transaction, whether I recalled Vanessa mentioning a particular trip or event around a certain withdrawal date. I answered as best I could, drawing on memory that felt, more and more as the weeks went on, like a second document I was learning to read for the first time. Every offhand comment from the last 8 months suddenly taking on a weight and a meaning I had missed entirely when it was first spoken. I remembered, sitting there, a dinner in early summer where Vanessa had come home late, claiming a staging job had run long, and had mentioned, almost in passing, that she had run into an old friend from the networking event at a restaurant downtown and stayed for a drink. I remembered not thinking anything of it at the time, filing it away the way you file away 1,000 small, unremarkable sentences a spouse says over the course of a marriage. I told Frank about it, and he made a note. And I understood, watching him write, that the dinner I had once considered forgettable was now evidence, a data point in a pattern that had been assembling itself in plain sight for months before Elaine Bell's phone call had ever given it a name. I thought, too, about Maddie, home for a long weekend in early autumn, sitting at that same kitchen table doing a crossword with her mother the way they used to when she was small, and how Vanessa had seemed, that whole weekend, brighter than she had in months, laughing easily, touching Maddie's hair the way she used to, and how I had felt, watching them, a small, guilty flicker of relief, a hope that whatever distance had crept into our marriage over the past year was simply a passing season, the kind every long marriage weathers eventually. I understood now, with the folder spread open on Frank's desk between us, that Vanessa's brightness that weekend had nothing to do with our marriage steadying itself. It had everything to do with a man named Marcus Bell, and a version of her own life she had already, quietly, begun choosing over the one she still had to pretend to want in front of our daughter. You okay? Frank asked, glancing up from the page in front of him, catching something in my face I had not managed to fully hide. I keep finding new things to grieve, I said. Every time I think I found the bottom of it, there's another layer underneath. Frank set down his pen and looked at me directly, the way he used to look at me across a lunch table in high school, when he could tell something was actually wrong beneath whatever I was saying out loud. That's normal, Dan, he said. This isn't a single wound. It's a slow unwinding of every assumption you built a life on top of. It's going to keep happening for a while, finding new things to grieve. The trick isn't making it stop. The trick is not letting it stop you from doing what needs to be done in the meantime. You can grieve and build at the same time. Most people who come through that door can't manage both. I think you can. I nodded, and Frank went back to the documents, turning the last few pages slowly, checking one final date against his notes, and I watched him set down the last sheet, square the stack of papers with both hands the way a man squares a deck of cards before dealing, and lean back in his chair with the particular stillness of someone who has finished forming a complete picture in his mind. Okay, he finally said, setting the folder down and folding his hands on top of it. Okay, he finally said, setting the folder down and folding his hands on top of it. Here is where we stand. You have clear evidence of dissipation. $63,500 moved out of a joint marital account, over 4 months, largely undocumented, or falsely documented as business expenses that don't correspond to any actual business activity her staging company shows on its books. That is significant. That is very significant, Dan. What about the house? I asked. What about the Whitmore Trust? The house is yours, Frank said. Inherited property, kept separate, never commingled, never refinanced in both names. As long as you haven't done anything since to blur that line, and it sounds like you haven't, the house stays yours, regardless of what happens with the marriage. The trust is more interesting. He tapped the folder. When did you establish it? 2.5 years ago. Before you suspected the affair? Before I suspected anything specific, I said. I noticed things. Spending. I wanted a door I controlled. Frank looked at me for a long moment, and something like respect passed over his face, quiet and unspoken, the way it does between two men who don't need to say a thing to understand each other. Dan, he said, you built yourself a lifeboat 2 years before you knew the ship was taking on water. That is going to matter more than you understand right now. That money is protected. It's not marital property in any meaningful sense a court is going to fight you over, especially given the timeline and the source. Your father's inheritance, kept separate, moved into a trust under a name that isn't even yours legally. That's about as clean a firewall as I've seen in 15 years of doing this. So what do I do now? I asked. Now, Frank said, you go home, and you keep being exactly who you've been being. Boring, steady, unremarkable. You let her keep thinking the biggest thing on your mind is a champagne package for a country club birthday party. Meanwhile, I want copies of every statement from that joint account going back 2 years, not 8 months. I want to see if this started smaller and grew, or if it started all at once. I want the name and account details of Vanessa's staging business, the actual LLC filing. Because if she's been running money through that business as a laundering layer, that's a separate problem for her. One that involves the IRS, not just me. And I want you to open a new individual checking account, today, this week, and start redirecting your own paycheck into it. Slowly, quietly. Not in a way she'll notice. You are not obligated to keep funding an account that's already been drained by someone else's affair. I nodded, taking it all in the way I used to take in a shift schedule that needed to be rebuilt from scratch after a storm knocked out 3 routes. Methodically, without panic, one problem at a time. One more thing, Frank said, as I stood to leave. Elaine Bell. Be careful there, Dan. Not because I don't believe her. I do. Everything you've shown me lines up too cleanly for her to be lying. But she has her own case, her own attorney, her own agenda, even if it's a righteous one. Make sure whatever you build with her, you build with your own lawyer's eyes on it too. Allies are good. Blind allies are dangerous. Understood, I said, and I shook his hand, and I drove to work with the strange, hollow calm of a man who has just been handed a plan for the first time in weeks. A plan that did not erase the pain sitting in his chest, but gave it, finally, somewhere useful to go. Over the following weeks, I built. I built quietly, the way my father used to build additions onto our house on weekends, one board at a time, never rushing, never announcing the finished product until it was ready to hold weight. I opened a new personal account at a different bank across town, one Vanessa had no reason to ever visit, and I began redirecting 70% of my paycheck into it, leaving just enough in the joint account to cover the mortgage, which was low since the house had been mine outright, and the handful of shared bills that would raise suspicion if they suddenly went unpaid. I requested 2 years of statements from First Heritage Bank, and Frank was right. There was a pattern, and it did not start with Marcus Bell. It started in small increments almost 18 months before Marcus, back when Vanessa's staging business first began quietly failing to turn the profits she claimed at dinner parties. Small withdrawals, a few hundred here, covering a shortfall in her business account that she never told me about. Then, when Marcus entered the picture 8 months ago, the withdrawals accelerated, grew larger, more frequent, until they became the $63,500 wound that had finally been made visible to me by a stranger's phone call. I found other things too. Things that had nothing to do with money, and everything to do with the slow erosion of something I had once believed was permanent. Text messages I was not supposed to see, glimpsed once when Vanessa left her phone unlocked on the kitchen counter while she showered. Messages from a contact saved simply as M, full of a kind of breathless, performative affection that I recognized with a wince, as language she had once used with me decades earlier, back when we were young and everything between us still felt like discovery instead of routine. I did not read all of it. I want to be honest about that. There is a point past which digging through the wreckage of your own marriage stops being investigation and starts being a kind of self-harm. And I tried, as best I could, to know exactly as much as I needed to know and no more. I photographed what mattered. I closed the phone. I walked away. And some nights I sat alone in the garage, the one place in the house that had always been fully mine, and I let myself grieve, quietly, for the marriage I had actually believed I was still in. Maddie called every Sunday, as always, and every Sunday I found a way to sound like myself. "How's Mom?" she asked once in early autumn, her voice carrying the easy warmth of a daughter who had no reason yet to suspect the ground beneath her family was shifting. She seemed kind of distracted at dinner last time I was home. "You know your mother," I said. "Always got 6 projects going at once." It was the truth wrapped so tightly in a half-lie that it barely counted as either, and I hated saying it. Hated that my daughter's easy trust in the stability of her family was now a resource I was quietly, carefully managing, rather than simply enjoying. But Frank had been clear, and my own instincts agreed with him. Maddie needed to hear this eventually, but not yet. Not until I understood the full shape of what I was protecting her from. Not until I could tell her the truth without also handing her a burden she was too far away at school to help carry. Denise, Vanessa's sister, called me directly only once during this period, in late September. Her voice bright and performative in the particular way that had always made me tired after even a short conversation. "Daniel, I just want to say, I think it's wonderful how supportive you've been of Vanessa's business this year," she said, apropos of nothing, and something in her tone made the hair on my arms stand up. Some instinct telling me that Denise knew more than she was letting on, that the family who had never quite respected the man from English Street had perhaps decided, collectively and silently, to let Vanessa's affair play out as though it were simply another one of her projects, so long as I kept paying for the birthday party and kept my mouth shut about the money. "I've always supported Vanessa," I said, which was true, and let the silence stretch just long enough that Denise, uncomfortable, filled it with a laugh and a change of subject. That was the moment, more than any single document Elaine Bell had sent me, that hardened something in my chest into a shape I did not fully recognize. It was one thing to learn my wife had betrayed me. It was another thing entirely to understand that her family, the family that had spent 24 years making small, polished comments about my modest house and my unglamorous job, had likely known, or at least suspected, and had chosen comfort and appearances over honesty with me. I thought of every dinner party where I had refilled glasses at the drink cart while they laughed about furniture. I thought of every Christmas where Vanessa's mother had asked, with a smile sharp enough to cut, whether I had ever considered something more ambitious than logistics. I understood, finally and completely, that I had spent 24 years being tolerated by people who had never once seen me clearly. They had no idea what was coming for them. Elaine and I spoke again in October, this time meeting in person at a diner 2 towns over, a neutral, anonymous place with vinyl booths and coffee that tasted like it had been on the burner since dawn. She was smaller than I had pictured from her voice, a compact, precise woman with steel gray eyes and a folder of her own, thicker than mine, resting on the table between us like a shared inheritance neither of us had asked for. "I filed for full divorce 2 weeks ago," she told me, stirring sugar into coffee she did not drink. "My attorney has already subpoenaed Bell Meridian Capital's business records. There is no real fund, Mr. Cole. There never was. Marcus takes money from women who trust him, moves it through a shell account, and either spends it or uses it to pay off the last woman he took from. Just enough to keep her quiet. Just enough that it looks, on paper, like a real return. It's not even sophisticated. It's just cruel." "How is that legal?" I said, not quite a question. "It isn't, not entirely," Elaine said. "That's why my attorney thinks the district attorney's office might finally take an interest, if we can show a pattern across multiple victims with dates and dollar amounts that line up. That's where you come in. Your documentation, combined with mine and one other woman's from Cincinnati, she's agreed to speak with an investigator, gives us 3 separate women, 3 separate timelines, all showing the same fraudulent pattern." I sat with that for a moment, watching steam rise off coffee neither of us was drinking. "What happens to Vanessa in all this?" I asked, and I noticed, saying it, that some part of me, even now, even after everything, still flinched at the idea of her facing real consequences, some old married reflex that had not yet caught up to the new architecture I was building around my life. That depends on what she knew, Elaine said, not unkindly. If she believed the investment was real, she's a victim too, in her own way, even if she's also the woman who had an affair with my husband. If she knew it was fraud and helped him find other women, that's different. I don't know which one she is, Mr. Cole. I only know my husband. I don't know your wife. I thought about that on the drive home. The question of which version of Vanessa I had actually been married to all these months. The betrayed fool, chasing something Marcus Bell had convinced her was real, desperate enough for excitement and validation that she never once asked the hard questions a smarter woman would have asked. Or something colder, something that had known, on some level, exactly what she was participating in, and had simply decided the thrill and the attention were worth the risk. I did not know, and in a strange way, it did not matter as much as I expected it to. Either version of the truth led to the same place. Either version meant the marriage I had spent 24 years believing in had already ended long before that phone call, and I was simply the last person in the story to find out. By the time November arrived, I had a plan fully formed, the same way a foundation, once poured and cured, simply waits for the frame to go up on top of it. Frank had filed the paperwork quietly, ready to be served the moment I gave the word. My savings sat, protected and growing, in the Whitmore Trust and my new individual account. Elaine's case against Marcus Bell had grown a third arm, the woman from Cincinnati, whose name I never learned, but whose story, when Elaine described it to me, sounded so achingly similar to Vanessa's that I felt something close to pity for all three of us. Three people who had been targeted, in our different ways, by the same slow, patient cruelty. There was only one piece left: the stage. And Vanessa, without knowing it, had already built it for me herself, 3 months earlier, when she'd circled a date in red ink on our kitchen calendar and asked me for a $4,000 deposit to reserve the ballroom at the Ridgemont Club. Her 50th birthday party, December the 14th, 200 guests, champagne, a string quartet, and, as I would come to learn only in the final week before the event, an announcement Vanessa had been planning for months, one she believed she would be making from a position of total control, in front of every person whose opinion had ever mattered to her. I want to slow down again here, because the weeks between that diner meeting with Elaine and the night of the party were, in their own quiet way, the hardest weeks of the entire ordeal. Not because anything dramatic happened. Nothing did on the surface. Vanessa and I moved through our days the way we always had. Dinners eaten mostly in silence, broken by small talk about the weather or Maddie's classes. Nights spent in the same bed, with an ocean of unspoken things stretching between us. The hardest part was the acting. Pretending to be a husband who still did not know. Pretending to care about seating charts and champagne packages, while quietly redirecting my paycheck into an account she would never see. Pretending, every single day, that furniture does not have ears. I found out about the announcement almost by accident, in the last week of November, when I came home early from a shift change and found Vanessa on the back porch, phone pressed to her ear, voice low, but not quite low enough. "I'm telling everyone at the party," she was saying, pacing, one hand pressed against her collarbone the way she did when she was nervous and trying not to show it. "It's the perfect moment, Marcus. Everyone I care about will be there. I want them to hear it from me, all at once, before Daniel even has a chance to make it messy." I stood very still in the kitchen doorway, out of her line of sight, and listened to my wife plan the public end of our marriage as though it were a party favor. As though the 200 guests gathering to celebrate her 50th birthday were really gathering, without knowing it, to witness her walk away from the life we had built, and toward a man who had already done this to at least 2 other women before her. Vanessa kept talking, her voice pitched low but carrying easily across the quiet kitchen, the way voices do in a house built decades before anyone worried much about insulation. "No, Marcus, listen to me," she said, and there was an edge of pleading in it I had not heard from her in years. Not directed at me, anyway. Not in a very long time. "I need this to go perfectly. My mother will be there. Denise will be there. I need everyone to see it happen the way I've pictured it, not some quiet conversation nobody remembers. I have spent my whole life being the responsible one, the practical one, married to the practical one. I want them to see me finally choose something for myself, for once, in front of everybody." There was a pause, and I understood, standing frozen in that doorway, that Marcus was saying something back to her, something I could not hear, and whatever it was made Vanessa laugh, a small, private laugh I recognized instantly and painfully as one she used to save only for me, years ago, back when we were young enough that laughter between us still meant something uncomplicated. "I know," she said. "I know you think I'm being dramatic, but you don't understand what it's like, being married to a man who's never once surprised you in 24 years. I need this. I need the room to gasp. I need them to finally see me as more than just Daniel's wife." I stood very still, one hand braced against the doorframe, and I felt something in my chest that I can only describe, even now, as a strange and complicated grief. Grief not just for the marriage, but for the woman on the other end of that phone call. A woman who had apparently spent 24 years feeling invisible beside me in a way I had never once understood. A woman who had decided, in the end, that the solution to feeling unseen was not honesty but spectacle. Not a hard conversation across a kitchen table, but a stage, an audience, a room full of witnesses to finally validate a version of herself she could not seem to build quietly, the way I had built everything else in my life. I thought, standing there, about something Elaine had told me weeks earlier, sitting in that vinyl booth at the diner, about the specific kind of woman Marcus Bell seemed to target. Not stupid women, not even necessarily unhappy women, not in any obvious, visible way. Women who felt unseen. Women who had built lives that looked, from the outside, entirely successful and stable, and who had quietly starved, for years, for someone to look at them the way they remembered being looked at once, a long time ago, before routine and responsibility had worn the shine off everything. Marcus Bell did not sell investment returns, Elaine had told me. He sold attention. The money was simply the mechanism by which he collected it. I understood, listening to Vanessa's voice through that doorway, exactly what Elaine had meant. And strangely, understanding it did not make me hate Vanessa less. If anything, it complicated the hatred I had been quietly nursing for weeks into something heavier and harder to hold. Something closer to pity laced through with anger. The particular ache of watching someone you loved for half your life make a catastrophic choice for reasons that were, in their own broken way, almost understandable. But understanding a wound does not mean you let it keep cutting you. My father used to say that about machinery, about people, about almost everything that eventually failed. You can understand exactly why a belt frayed and still know it needs replacing before it snaps and takes your hand with it. I have to go, Vanessa said into the phone, her voice shifting, brightening artificially, the tone she used when she sensed someone might be listening, even when she could not see anyone. Daniel will be home soon. I love you. I'll see you Thursday. A pause. I know. Me too. I love you. 2 words I had heard from her 1,000 times across 24 years, offered now, casually, to a man who had already stolen $63,500 from our marriage, and who, according to his own wife, had done the exact same thing to at least 2 other women before Vanessa had ever walked into that networking event. I felt something in me go very cold and very still. The particular stillness that comes not from the absence of feeling, but from feeling so much, all at once, that the body simply refuses to let any of it show on the surface. I thought about Maddie, 3 hours away at State, unaware that her mother was on the back porch of the house she had grown up in, telling another woman's husband that she loved him. I thought about the folder sitting in my desk drawer upstairs, thickening week by week with dates and dollar amounts, and Elaine's careful documentation. I thought about Detective Reyes's voice on the phone, calm and professional, telling me that patterns mattered more than outrage, that the district attorney's office needed evidence, not emotion, and that the surest way to lose a case like this one was to let anger get ahead of preparation. I thought, too, about the version of myself that had danced with Vanessa near a punch table 26 years earlier. Impulsive and unguarded. And I understood, standing in that doorway listening to the woman that young man had fallen in love with tell another man she loved him, that the doorway I was standing in was really 2 doorways at once. One led back into a kitchen, where a marriage was quietly, finally ending. The other led forward, toward a version of myself I had been slowly building for months without fully realizing it. A version capable of standing in exactly this kind of moment and choosing, deliberately, not to break. I made that choice standing right there, in the space between the 2 doorways, in the space between who I had been and who I was becoming. I did not confront her. I want you to understand how much restraint that took. Standing in my own kitchen, hearing my wife discuss the choreography of leaving me in front of an audience like it was a stage production she had been rehearsing in secret. But Frank's voice was in my head, calm and certain. Do not tip her off. Let her build the stage. Let her invite the audience. And when the curtain rises, Dan, make sure you are the one holding the script. I went back out to my truck, sat for 10 minutes doing nothing but breathing, and then drove around the block and came back in through the front door, calling out a normal hello. And Vanessa met me in the front hall with a bright, practiced smile that I now understood, with perfect clarity, was a mask she had been wearing for months. And I smiled back, with a mask of my own. And for the first time since this had all begun, I felt something almost like gratitude toward her. Strange as that sounds. She had, without meaning to, handed me the exact stage I needed. I called Frank that night from the garage. She's planning to announce it publicly, I told him, at the birthday party, in front of everyone. There was a pause, and then, unmistakably, I heard Frank exhale a short, sharp laugh. The laugh of a man who has just watched an opposing lawyer make a critical mistake in open court. Dan, he said, that is the single best gift she could have handed you. Do you understand that? She wants an audience for her exit. Fine. Give her one. But we make sure that by the time she opens her mouth, there is nothing left for her to announce. Because you will have already told the truth first. How? I asked. We serve her before the party, Frank said. Quietly, no drama. A process server catches her at home 2 days before, hands her the papers. Done. She'll know you know. She may even cancel the party out of panic. But my guess, knowing what you've told me about this woman, is that she won't. My guess is she'll try to spin it, tell her family it's just paperwork, a formality, nothing that changes her plan for the big reveal. People like that don't cancel the show, Dan. They just rewrite the ending in their head to still come out looking like the hero. He was right. He was more right than either of us knew. I also called Elaine that week and told her about the party, the date, the venue. There was a long silence on the line, and then she said quietly, Marcus is going to be there, isn't he? In the room, in front of everyone. I believe so, I said. Vanessa's been telling people he's her business partner for the staging venture, a cover story for why he'd be a guest. Then I want to be there too, Elaine said, and something in her voice had steadied into a kind of resolve I recognized, because I had been carrying the same resolve myself for weeks. I have spent 2 years watching that man humiliate me in private. I would like, just once, to watch him lose something in public. I did not say yes right away. I thought of Frank's warning about allies and agendas, about making sure whatever I built with Elaine Bell was something I understood fully before I let it stand beside me in the most important room of the next several months of my life. But when I called Frank the next morning and told him what Elaine had asked, he was quiet for a long moment, and then he said something that settled it for me completely. Dan, he said, you've spent your whole life being underestimated by people who never bothered to look closely at what you were actually capable of. Elaine Bell has spent 2 years being underestimated by the exact same kind of person. Let her stand next to you when the truth comes out. Some victories you don't have to win alone. I called Elaine back that evening. Come, I said. Bring your attorney's contact information. Bring whatever documentation you're comfortable sharing publicly. And Elaine, thank you. For all of it. For calling me that first night when you didn't have to. I called you, she said, because 2 years ago I wished someone had called me. There was one more piece I needed before I was ready, and it took me the better part of 2 weeks to arrange it. I remembered, from a conversation with Frank early on, an offhand mention of a friend of his from law school who now worked in the financial crimes unit of the county sheriff's department, a detective named Reyes who had, according to Frank, put more small-time con men behind bars than anyone in 3 counties. I asked Frank to make the introduction, and Detective Reyes and I spoke on the phone for nearly an hour, going over the documentation Elaine and I had assembled, the pattern across 3 women, the amounts, the timeline, the shell structure of Bell Meridian Capital. This is good work, Reyes told me, and I could hear, even over the phone, the particular satisfaction of a professional recognizing competence in an amateur who had done the job right. We've actually had a flag on Marcus Bell's name before, a complaint filed 18 months ago that never went anywhere because the woman withdrew her statement. This might be enough to reopen it properly. I can't promise you an arrest on a timeline, Mr. Cole. These things move slowly. But I can tell you we're watching him now, seriously, for the first time. Is there anything I can do to help move it faster? I asked. Reyes was quiet for a moment. You said there's a public event coming up, a party where this man is expected to be present along with your wife and possibly the other victim's evidence coming together at the same time. December 14th, I said. The Ridgemont Club. If things develop the way you're describing, Reyes said carefully, and if we've built enough by then, it's not out of the question that we could have someone in the vicinity that night. I'm not promising a scene, Mr. Cole. I'm not going to walk into a birthday party and put handcuffs on a man in front of 200 witnesses just for drama's sake. But if the evidence is solid, and I believe by then it will be, we don't need drama. We just need to be paying attention at the right moment. I hung up the phone that night with something settling in my chest that I had not felt in months. Not triumph, not yet. Something quieter. The particular calm of a man who has finally finished checking every bolt on a structure he is about to trust his whole weight to. The party was 11 days away. I had a lawyer ready to serve papers. I had an ally in Elaine Bell, walking into that room carrying 2 years of her own quiet devastation. I had a detective, watching from somewhere just outside the frame. I had a folder, thick now, dense with dates and numbers and names, sitting in my desk drawer at home, still labeled, in my own steady handwriting, simply household. And I had, more than anything else, 24 years of being underestimated by every single person who was about to walk into that ballroom, believing they already knew exactly who Daniel Cole was. They had no idea, standing in their expensive dresses and their rented tuxedos, sipping champagne they thought I was still paying for out of an account I had quietly stopped feeding weeks ago. That the man they called Furniture had spent the last 2 months building the very trap the whole room was about to walk directly into. I served her on a Tuesday, 2 days before the party, exactly the way Frank and I had planned. I was not there when it happened, deliberately, both because Frank advised it and because some small, tender part of me could not bear to watch Vanessa's face crumble at the exact moment she understood the truth was already ahead of her, waiting in a stack of legal paper on our own front porch instead of on a stage of her own choosing. Frank called me an hour later. "It's done," he said. "Process server caught her coming home from the salon. She called me directly, screaming 20 minutes ago." He paused. "Dan, she thinks this is about the affair. Just the affair. She has no idea we know about the money yet. My guess is she's going to try to talk her way through the party like nothing happened. Tell everyone the divorce filing is a misunderstanding, something she'll sort out privately with you after. She still thinks she controls the narrative." "She's about to learn otherwise," I said. I went home that evening to find the house eerily quiet, Vanessa's car gone from the driveway, and I sat alone at the kitchen table where this entire journey had started, 2 months earlier, over a cup of cold coffee and a stranger's phone call. I opened the folder one more time, checked every document, every date, every dollar amount, the way my father used to check the tension on a bandsaw blade one final time before he ever brought wood to the machine. Everything was there. Everything was ready. 2 days later, I put on the only tailored suit I owned, a charcoal gray one Vanessa had once bought me for a company gala years earlier, and complained, privately to Denise, that I never wore right. I wore it exactly right that night. I straightened my own tie in the bathroom mirror, and for the first time in longer than I could remember, the man looking back at me did not look like Furniture. He looked like a man who had built something with his own 2 hands, quietly, in the dark, while everyone around him assumed he was simply standing still. I drove to the Ridgemont Club alone, because Vanessa had left hours earlier to help set up, and I sat in the parking lot for a full minute before going in, watching valets in red jackets park a line of luxury cars belonging to people who had spent 24 years politely tolerating me. And I thought about the folder sitting on the passenger seat beside me, and about Elaine Bell, somewhere in that lot too, walking toward the same doors with 2 years of her own quiet devastation folded up inside her chest. I picked up the folder. I stepped out of the truck, and I walked, calm and steady, toward the brightest, most dangerous room I had ever entered in my life. The Ridgemont Club rose up out of the manicured dark like something built specifically to remind a man like me exactly how far outside its walls I had always stood, even after 24 years of walking through its doors on Vanessa's arm. Stone columns flanked the entrance, uplit in soft amber, and beyond them, through tall windows already glowing gold with chandelier light, I could see the shapes of 200 people moving through a room dressed in more money than my father had earned in a decade of honest work. I stood at the base of the front steps for a moment, folder pressed against my side, and felt the cold December air settle against the back of my neck, sharp and clean. The kind of air that makes everything feel suddenly, startlingly real. My phone buzzed once in my jacket pocket, and I checked it before going any further. A habit 2 months of careful preparation had worn into me as deeply as checking a bank statement on a Sunday night. It was a text from Detective Reyes. In position. Take your time. We're not going anywhere. 5 words that settled something in my chest that had been humming, low and constant, since the moment I stepped out of my truck. I was not walking into that ballroom alone, even though every person inside it believed, without question, that I was. I heard footsteps on the gravel behind me, and turned to find Elaine Bell approaching from the far end of the parking lot. Her coat pulled tight against the cold, her face composed in the particular way I had come to recognize over the past 2 months, as the look of a woman holding herself together through sheer force of will. She stopped beside me at the base of the steps, and for a moment, neither of us said anything at all. 2 strangers bound together by the same slow, patient cruelty, standing at the threshold of the room where it was finally going to end. "You ready?" she asked finally, her breath fogging faintly in the cold. "No," I said, honestly, because there did not seem to be any point lying to her. Not after everything we had built together over the last 2 months. But I don't think ready is a feeling that's coming. I think it's just a decision you make, anyway. Elaine almost smiled at that, a small, tired curve at the corner of her mouth. "That's the truest thing anyone said to me in 2 years," she said. Marcus always used to tell me I overthought everything, that I needed to just relax and trust him. I spent a long time believing that was a character flaw in me, instead of a warning sign about him. She looked up at the glowing windows of the ballroom, at the shapes of guests moving behind the glass, laughing at things neither of us could hear. "I keep waiting to feel something like satisfaction. I don't yet. Maybe it comes later." "Maybe it does," I said. "Or maybe satisfaction isn't really what either of us is walking in there for." She looked at me then, really looked at me, in a way almost no one had looked at me in the 24 years I had spent standing quietly at the edges of rooms just like this one. "What are you walking in there for, Daniel?" I thought about it for a long moment, watching my own breath curl and vanish in the cold December air. "My daughter," I finally said. "She doesn't know any of this yet. Not really, not the details. When I finally do sit her down and tell her everything, I want to be able to tell her the whole story, start to finish. A story where her father did not fall apart, where he built something instead. I'm walking in there for the version of this story I get to hand her someday. Not for revenge, for an ending she can actually be proud of." Elaine was quiet for a moment, and something in her face softened, the composed mask slipping just slightly to reveal the exhausted, grieving woman underneath it. The same woman who had sat across from me in a vinyl diner booth months earlier and handed me a folder that would end up saving my entire life. "I don't have children," she said quietly. "Marcus and I tried, years ago, before I understood who he really was. I think, in some strange way, I'm walking in there for the women who come after me, the ones I'll never meet. If what happens tonight stops even one more woman from getting a phone call like the one I gave you, then it will have been worth every terrible thing it cost me to make it happen. I did not have a response to that worthy of what she had just said, so I simply nodded, and the two of us stood there together at the base of those stone steps for one more moment. Two people who had never met before 2 months ago, bound now by something stronger than most of the relationships either of us had spent our lives cultivating. Then, without another word, we climbed the steps together, side by side, and pushed through the heavy carved doors into the warm, golden light of the Ridgemont Club. The foyer was a hushed, marble-floored space, all soft piano music piped in from somewhere overhead, and the faint, expensive smell of white lilies arranged in tall vases along the walls. A young woman at a small podium checked names against a guest list, and when I gave mine, she smiled the polite, practiced smile of someone paid to make wealthy people feel important and said, "Right this way, Mr. Cole. The Whitfield party is already gathering in the main ballroom." I noticed, distantly, that she had used Vanessa's maiden name for the party, Whitfield, not Cole. A small, telling detail I had not caught on the invitation months earlier, and that struck me now, standing in that marble foyer, as one more quiet piece of evidence that some part of Vanessa had already begun, long before that night, preparing to walk back out of my name and into whatever came next. "Ms. Bell, will you be joining a specific table?" the young woman asked, glancing at Elaine's name on a separate line of the guest list, a line I had personally, carefully arranged to have added weeks earlier through a quiet conversation with the club's events coordinator, framed simply as a late addition to the guest count. "I'll find my seat," Elaine said, and the young woman nodded, and we moved past the podium together, into a wide corridor lined with photographs of past club galas, decades of Ridgemont's wealthiest families smiling out from silver frames, none of whom, I understood now with a clarity that would have seemed impossible to me 2 months earlier, had ever once had to build anything with their own 2 hands, the way I had spent the last 2 months building this. I paused at the end of that corridor, just before the archway that opened into the ballroom itself, and Elaine paused beside me. And for one final moment, the two of us stood together in the quiet, golden hush of that hallway, listening to the low, contented murmur of 200 people who had no idea their evening was about to change. "Whatever happens in there," Elaine said quietly, "thank you. For believing a stranger's phone call, most men wouldn't have." "Most men," I said, "have never had to learn what I've had to learn about patience." I adjusted the folder beneath my arm one final time, feeling the weight of it, dense with 2 months of quiet, careful work. And I thought, one last time, about my father standing over a stalled engine with a rag in his back pocket, never in a hurry, never raising his voice at a machine that could not hear him anyway. "Let's go," I said. The ballroom at the Ridgemont Club was already half full when I walked in, chandeliers throwing soft gold light across round tables draped in white linen, a string quartet tuning quietly near the far wall beneath a banner that read, in elegant cursive script, "Celebrating 50 fabulous years, Vanessa." I stood in the doorway for a moment, folder tucked beneath my arm like an ordinary planner, and let the room wash over me, the perfume and the low murmur of 100 conversations, and the particular, specific brightness of people who believe, tonight, that nothing is about to go wrong. Denise spotted me first, waving me over to a cluster near the bar with a smile that did not quite reach her eyes. The smile of a woman managing a secret she had decided, weeks ago, was none of her business to disturb. "Daniel, doesn't the room look incredible? Vanessa outdid herself." Behind her, I could see Vanessa's parents, her mother in pearls, her father nursing a scotch, both of them offering me the same thin, polite nod they had offered me at every family gathering for 24 years. The nod that said, without ever saying it out loud. "We are not quite sure why she chose you, but we suppose you'll do." It does look incredible, I agreed, and I meant it in the way that a man can admire the architecture of a stage even while he waits, patiently, for the moment the whole set collapses. I found Vanessa near the center of the room, radiant in a deep red gown, laughing with a group of women from her book club, and when she saw me approaching, something flickered behind her eyes, fast and hard to read, before the practiced smile slid back into place. "You made it," she said, kissing the air near my cheek. "Frank's paperwork. We'll talk about that later. Tonight is not the night, Daniel." "Of course," I said. "Tonight is your night." She did not catch the second meaning in my voice. She was already turning away, scanning the room, and I followed her gaze to the entrance, where a tall man in a well-cut navy suit had just walked in. Tan skin, watch glinting under the chandelier light, moving through the crowd with the easy, practiced confidence of a man who has never once doubted that a room would want him in it. Marcus Bell. I had seen photographs by then, dozens of them, in the documents Elaine had sent, but seeing him in person, watching him kiss Denise's hand and clap Vanessa's father on the shoulder like an old friend, was something else entirely. It was watching a predator walk calmly into a room full of people who had no idea what he was. Behind him, quiet and composed in a simple charcoal dress that made no attempt to compete with the room's borrowed glamour, walked Elaine Bell. I watched Vanessa's face when she spotted Elaine. Confusion first, a small furrow between her brows, the look of a woman trying to place a face she has only ever seen in photographs on her lover's phone. Then something colder. Then, unmistakably, fear. Quick and gone, replaced almost instantly by the same bright, brittle smile she had been wearing all night. "Who invited her?" Vanessa murmured, mostly to herself, and I said nothing, because the answer, of course, was me. And this was not yet the moment for her to know that. Dinner passed the way these things do. Small talk stretched thin over a meal nobody was really tasting. Toasts offered by Denise and by Vanessa's college roommate, warm laughter rippling through the room while Marcus Bell sat 2 tables away, making easy conversation with a group of men who had no idea they were sharing a bottle of wine with a con artist. I watched Elaine, seated alone near the back, her hands folded on the table in front of her, waiting, the way I was waiting, for the moment that was coming. It came just after the cake, a 3-tiered thing Vanessa had ordered from a bakery downtown instead of making it herself for the first time in 20 years. When she stood, tapped a fork gently against her champagne glass, and the room fell into an easy, expectant hush. "I want to thank you all for being here tonight," Vanessa began, her voice warm and steady, a voice I had heard deliver 1,000 toasts over the years, always poised, always exactly the right amount of vulnerable. Turning 50 has a way of making you think about the life you've built, and the life you actually want going forward. A small, practiced laugh rippled through the crowd. "I've spent a long time being careful, being safe, and I've realized, this year especially, that safe isn't the same thing as happy." I felt the room's attention drift toward me, a slow, curious ripple, the way a crowd senses a story arriving before the words fully land. And I kept my face perfectly still, the way my father used to keep his face still watching a piece of machinery he already knew was about to fail. "I want to be honest with the people I love," Vanessa continued, and beside her, Marcus Bell had gone very still, his easy smile fixed in place like a mask starting to slip at the edges. "Life is short, and I think it's time I stop pretending to be someone I'm not, in a marriage that stopped—" "Vanessa," I said. I did not shout it. I did not need to. I simply said her name, clear and level, into the small pause she had left for effect, and something about the calm certainty in my voice cut through the room more sharply than any raised voice could have. Every head turned toward me. I stood, slowly, the folder in my hand, and I felt, for the first time in 24 years, every single eye in that room actually seeing me. "Before you finish that sentence," I said, "I think everyone deserves to hear the whole story, not just the version you rehearsed." Vanessa's face went white, then red, her composure cracking in real time in front of 200 people who had known her, in some cases, her entire life. "Daniel, this is not the time." "You're right," I said. "It's not the time you planned. It's the time that's actually happening." I opened the folder. My hands, I noticed distantly, did not shake at all. "This is the account statement from First Heritage Bank, our joint checking account, showing 11 separate withdrawals totaling $63,500 over the last 8 months. Every single one of those withdrawals went, directly or indirectly, to a company called Bell Meridian Capital." I looked up, found Marcus Bell's eyes across the room, watched the color drain from his practiced, tan face in real time. "A company that does not actually invest in anything. A company built to take money from women who trust the wrong man." A murmur swept through the room, sharp and immediate, chairs creaking as people turned toward Marcus, toward Vanessa, toward the sudden, electric wrongness of a party curdling into something else entirely. "Daniel, stop," Vanessa said, her voice dropping low, urgent, the kind of urgent whisper meant only for me, except the room had gone quiet enough that everyone heard it anyway. "I'm not the only one he's done this to," I said, and I turned toward the back of the room. "Elaine, would you like to say something?" Elaine Bell rose from her seat, calm and composed, and walked toward the front of the room with a folder of her own, thicker than mine, and the sight of her, walking steadily through a crowd of strangers she had never met, carrying 2 years of quiet devastation in a single manila folder, was one of the most quietly courageous things I have ever witnessed in my life. "My name is Elaine Bell," she said, her voice clear and even. "I'm Marcus's wife." A gasp rippled through the crowd, several heads turning sharply toward Marcus, who had gone rigid in his seat, his easy smile long gone. "I filed for divorce 6 weeks ago, after 2 years of documenting what my husband does. Vanessa is not the first woman he has done this to. She's the third that I know of. A woman in Cincinnati lost nearly $40,000 2 years ago. A woman here in town lost $20,000 before that. There is no investment fund. There never was." The room had gone utterly, completely silent, the kind of silence that has weight, that presses down on every person sitting inside it. "Marcus," Vanessa said, her voice cracking, turning toward him with something desperate and pleading in her eyes, the look of a woman realizing, in real time, in front of everyone she has ever tried to impress, that the ground beneath her has never once been solid. "Tell them this isn't true. Tell them." Marcus Bell said nothing. He sat very still, his jaw working silently, his eyes darting toward the exits, toward Elaine, toward Vanessa, toward the growing wall of stairs from a room full of people who, 20 minutes earlier, had been raising champagne glasses in his honor. In the silence, I heard, distantly, the sound of a door opening at the back of the ballroom, and I saw Detective Reyes step quietly inside, in plain clothes, unhurried, flanked by a second officer, and I understood that the timing Frank had promised, the quiet arrival at exactly the right moment, had finally come to pass. "Marcus Bell," Reyes said, his voice carrying easily across the stunned room. "I need a few minutes of your time regarding a financial fraud investigation. We can do this quietly, outside, or we can do it right here. Your choice." The room erupted into a low, horrified murmur as Marcus Bell rose from his chair, his composure completely gone, his hands shaking as he reached, absurdly, for his water glass and knocked it over instead, sending a thin stream across the white tablecloth. He said something to Reyes, low and pleading, and I watched, with a strange, quiet ache in my chest that surprised me even then, as a man who had walked into that room like he owned it, walked out of it 15 minutes later looking like exactly what he was, small and frightened, and finally caught. Vanessa stood frozen at the front of the room, the microphone still hanging loosely in her hand, her 50th birthday banner glowing above her head in cruel, cheerful cursive. And 200 people, her family, her friends, her book club, her sister, stared at her in a silence thick enough to choke on. "You're like furniture, Daniel," I said quietly, into that silence, and I watched her flinch as though I had struck her, because she remembered saying it, remembered exactly when and where and how casually she had laughed while she said it. "Sturdy, reliable, you just sort of sit there." I let the words hang in the air for a moment, and then I closed the folder in my hands, calm and final. "Furniture doesn't move, Vanessa, but it does notice everything that happens in the room." I did not raise my voice. I did not need to. I turned and I walked out of that ballroom, past 200 stunned faces, past Denise with her hand pressed over her mouth, past Vanessa's mother clutching her pearls, past a banner that read, "Celebrating 50 fabulous years," in a room that would never, as long as any of them lived, celebrate anything about that night again. Elaine caught up to me in the parking lot, her heels clicking fast against the pavement, her breath coming in short, disbelieving bursts, somewhere between laughter and tears. "I have wanted to do that for 2 years," she said. "I didn't know it would feel like that." "How does it feel?" I asked. She thought about it for a long moment, looking back at the glowing windows of the ballroom behind us, where chaos was still visibly unfolding, guests filing out in confused, urgent clusters. "Lighter," she finally said. "For the first time in 2 years, I feel lighter." I understood exactly what she meant, because standing there in that parking lot, in a suit that finally fit the man wearing it, I felt something similar settle over my own chest. Not triumph, not quite, but something close to it. Something closer to relief. The particular hard-won relief of a man who has spent months carrying a weight in total silence and has finally been allowed to set it down in front of the very people who put it there. I did not go back inside. There was nothing left in that ballroom that belonged to me anymore. The days that followed the party moved fast, faster than anything in the 2 preceding months, the way water moves fast once a dam has finally broken after holding for a long, long time. Marcus Bell was formally arrested 3 days later, charges of wire fraud and theft by deception filed by the district attorney's office, built on the combined testimony and documentation of 3 women across 2 counties: Elaine, myself, and the woman from Cincinnati whose name I finally learned only when it appeared, briefly, in a local news article about the arrest. Her name was Patricia. I think about her sometimes, a woman I never met, whose $40,000 loss all those years before mine had quietly helped build the case that finally stopped him. Vanessa did not come home the night of the party, and when she finally called me 2 days later, Her voice was small in a way I had genuinely never heard it before in 24 years of marriage. All the polish and performance stripped away, leaving behind something raw and frightened. "Daniel," she said, "I need to understand what's happening to my life." "You need a lawyer," I said, not unkindly, but not softly either. "I'd suggest you find one who isn't Marcus Bell's." There was a long silence on the line, and then, quietly, she began to cry. And some old, tired part of me wanted to comfort her, the reflex of 24 years not disappearing overnight simply because the marriage that built that reflex had. But I did not comfort her. I let her cry, and when she finally asked me, in a small, broken voice, whether there was any chance we could fix this, I told her the truth. "No," I said. "I don't think there is. I think you decided that a long time before I did, Vanessa. I'm just the one who finally caught up." The divorce moved through the courts over the following months with a speed and clarity that Frank later told me was rare, almost entirely because the evidence of dissipation was so thoroughly, meticulously documented that Vanessa's own attorney advised her not to contest it. She kept her car, a modest settlement, and very little else, because there was very little else left to divide once the $63,500 was accounted for as her own misuse of marital funds, once the house was confirmed as separate inherited property, once the Whitmore Trust, sitting quietly untouched for 2.5 years, was ruled entirely outside the marriage altogether. Denise called me once, in the spring, her voice carrying none of its old bright performance, asking, almost timidly, whether I might be willing to speak with Vanessa's mother, who had apparently taken the whole affair very hard, feeling that the family's reputation at the club had been, in her words, irreparably damaged. I told Denise, gently but firmly, that I hoped her mother's reputation recovered, but that I no longer had any obligation to manage anyone's comfort in that family, including my own former wife's. Denise did not call again after that, and I found, to my own mild surprise, that I did not miss the calls. I told Maddie everything, finally, in January, sitting across from her at the same kitchen table where this entire story had begun, 2 months after the party, once the shock had settled enough for me to explain it without my voice breaking halfway through. She listened in near total silence, her jaw tight, her eyes bright with tears she refused to let fall, and when I finished, she reached across the table and took both my hands in hers. "You did all of that," she said slowly, "without telling me. For 2 months. You carried all of it alone." "I didn't want you carrying it too," I said. "Not until I understood exactly what it was." She was quiet for a long moment, and then she said something I have carried with me every day since. "Dad," she said, "I always thought you were the quiet one in this family. The boring one, even, sometimes, when Mom used to joke about it. I never once thought you were the strong one." She squeezed my hands. "I was wrong. I think you might be the strongest person I've ever known." I did not know what to say to that, so I simply held on to my daughter's hands across that kitchen table, in the house my father built, in the quiet I had fought so hard, so patiently to protect, and I let myself, for just a moment, feel the full weight of everything I had carried finally settle into something that felt, at last, like peace. Elaine and I stayed in touch after everything settled, an unlikely friendship built out of shared devastation and shared eventual victory. She finalized her divorce from Marcus that same spring, moved to a smaller house outside the city, and started, slowly, to rebuild a life that had spent 2 years being quietly hollowed out without her fully understanding why. Marcus Bell was eventually convicted on multiple counts, sentenced to 4 years, with restitution ordered to all 3 women. Restitution I never expected to see much of, and mostly didn't, though the conviction itself mattered more to me than the money ever fully could. I sold the Ridgemont Club membership Vanessa had insisted we needed for 6 years, a membership I had never once wanted or used, and I used part of the money to help fund Maddie's junior year abroad program, the one that had nearly been sacrificed to Marcus Bell's fake investment fund. I fixed up the house my father built, slowly, the way he would have wanted. 1 room at a time. No rush, no announcement. Just steady, patient work with my own 2 hands. I think sometimes about the man I was the night that phone rang, sitting at my kitchen table with cold coffee and a party flyer soaking through beside him. A man who believed in that moment that his entire life had just ended. I understand now that he was both right and wrong. A life did end that night, but it was not my whole life. It was only the version of my life built on a foundation I had never fully examined. A marriage I had let myself believe was solid simply because I had never bothered to check the load-bearing walls. I check things now. I always did, in truth, my whole life. But I understand the value of it differently now. The way you understand the value of a locked door only after you've lived through a night when someone tried the handle and found it unyielding. If you have ever sat at your own kitchen table, staring down a truth you were not ready to face, if you have ever been called furniture by someone who mistook your steadiness for weakness, I want you to hear this clearly. Quiet is not the same as weak. Patient is not the same as powerless. Some of the strongest people you will ever meet are the ones nobody in the room bothered to look at twice, right up until the moment they finally decided to stand up. I do not know everything that is happening in your life tonight, but if some part of what I've shared here found its way to something true in your own story, I would love to hear it. Tell me in the comments about a moment when you were underestimated and what it felt like the day that finally changed. And if this story meant something to you, if it reminded you of your own quiet strength, take a moment to like this video and subscribe so more stories like this one can find the people who need them. We none of us know, walking into an ordinary Tuesday, what is waiting for us on the other end of the phone. But I have learned this much in the year since that call changed everything. However dark the room gets, however long you have to sit quietly in it building something no one else can see, the light does come back. And when it does, you will not simply survive what happened to you. You will finally, fully, understand exactly what you were capable of the entire time.